Welcome to the Patton College of Education's new Munch and Learn series, Global Issues on Immigration. Through these discussions, we seek to increase our understanding of others in order to advocate for and build more inclusive communities. The intersection of immigration and higher education is long-standing. It is important to understand how current immigration challenges and policies are impacting our students and campuses and communities, and determine how best to support them. Why should we prioritize support for undocumented students and international students? According to the Center for Higher Education Leadership, first-generation immigrant students, including undocumented students, second-generation immigrant students, and international students make up close to a third of all students in post-secondary education nationally. Bringing it closer to home, Ohio University's Athens campus and the Patton College have international students enrolled at over 4%. Many first and second generation immigrant and international students look to see whether campuses and institutions are undocu-friendly. In other words, are we welcoming, inclusive, and supportive? How institutions and colleges of education respond to immigrants, international students, and their families matters. Much can be done to be an inclusive university and to demonstrate our support for these students. But as with any students, we need to avoid one-size-fits-all approaches to advising and student support. Instead, we must develop culturally responsive and integrative student-centered care. According to NCCREST, a global association for academic advisors in higher education, a culturally responsive student support and advising approach considers social and psychological conditions that affect this particular student demographic. Undocumented immigrant families face constant economic, social, and legal challenges. They increasingly experience the psychological impacts of being a cultural but not a legal citizen and may feel like they are living in limbo, not fully belonging anywhere. Only a small percentage of undocumented students actually pursue and successfully complete U.S. post-secondary education. And those who do make it to college have overcome great odds and have built above average resiliency. According to NCCREST, best practices for building an inclusive culture involve creating a network of support, creating safe spaces to enhance peer and ally support, ensuring confidentiality and campus safety, and providing outreach and resources, including critical legal support and promoting civic engagement. As we begin our discussions on global issues on immigration, know that this series aspires to address these best practices to encourage meaningful dialogue. While we are talking about best practices for higher education, we must particularly employ these practices in colleges of education. We are preparing the next generation of teachers and human service professionals who will also need to provide culturally relevant support and services to immigrant children and families. Recent demographics from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Pew Research Center shows that in 2012, there were 11.4 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, or 3.5% of the nation's population, from which approximately 2.1 million were K-12 aged students. Our nation's past practices and how we treated children and families who are seeking to come to the United States for a better life have not been representative of who we have historically been as Americans. We have a responsibility to turn the page on that sad history. On the day of his inauguration, President Biden did just that. He signed an executive order to preserve the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, otherwise known as DACA, which has shielded hundreds of thousands of people who came to our country as young children from deportation. In the words of Miriam Feldblum, co-founder and executive director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, if we're to think broadly about the impacts of immigration across our campuses and act collaboratively, locally, and nationally to support students and other campus stakeholders, we will be in a position to effect positive change in the short and long term. It's the right thing to do, it's the wise thing to do, and it is at the core of our educational missions and communities. Thank you for joining this session on global issues on immigration.
Good afternoon. My name is Chip Rice, and I am the Grant Development Coordinator for the Patton College of Education here at Ohio University. I will be your moderator for today's panel discussion on honoring and supporting the experiences of immigrant populations in university and community life. This is the last of our four-part Munch and Learn series about global issues on immigration. These have been sponsored by the Patton College of Education at Ohio University. So as we get started, I want to let you know that we will be recording this session and it will live with the other 3 sessions on the Patton College YouTube channel. I also encourage you to participate. You can participate by placing your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. Due to time constraints, we may not get to all questions. And last, there will be an evaluation that near the close of the session will be placed in the chat. We would love for you to take a moment, complete the evaluation, and provide us some feedback on your experience with our Munch and Learn series. So let's get things started. I'd like to introduce today's panel. First is Salome Aluso. Salome is a doctoral candidate in the Patton College of Education at Ohio University. Salome, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion today. My name is Salome Aluso. I'm a third-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Higher Education and Student Affairs. I'm also an international student from Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you, Salome. Next, I would like to introduce Diane Cahill. Diane is the Director for International Student and Faculty Services. Diane, welcome.
Thank you, Chip. International Student and Faculty Services provides immigration support for international students, and we also provide other supports such as orientation and just making sure that students have what they need while they are here. So thank you for asking me to be here today.
You're welcome, and I'm so glad you're here. And last will be Jerry Kurzik. Jerry is the Director of the Ohio Program of Intensive English here at Ohio University. Jerry, welcome.
Thank you, Chip, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today, and yes, I'm direct the Ohio Program of Intensive English, where we are often the front door for many students who come to Ohio University. And it's been my privilege over the years to teach and interact with students and professionals from across the world. So I look forward to today's conversation.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, I'd like to kick things off by going to our student and going to Salome. So Salome, as an international student, you came to Athens. We would like to honor your experience by getting some insight on how your journey has unfolded. Can you give us a sense of how it felt to come to Athens, Ohio as a new student?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And just when I think about, that drive from Columbus Airport to Athens, Ohio University, I remember having a mixture of feelings. So on one hand, I was very excited because I had never thought in any of my wildest dreams that a first generation student like me would get an opportunity to get out of my my home country, Kenya, to go and study abroad. So for me, this was a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I knew that this opportunity was going to open so many doors for me, especially professionally. But on the other hand, I was also very anxious because I knew I was coming to a different country, a different culture and way of life. And I don't think anything that I Googled at that time really prepared me for the culture shock that I faced when I came here, because even on that day when I was driving from the airport to Athens, my friend stopped by a restaurant and I honestly didn't even understand anything that was on the menu. And I was wondering, like, what did I get myself into? But also, I had come here for academic reasons. And I know that the US system of education is different from the Kenyan system of education. So I didn't know exactly, like what to expect and what I would have to do to succeed academically. And I was also coming in with the position of being a teaching assistant. And so I knew that I was going to be the primary instructor for a class that I was teaching. And in as much as I had taught back in my home country, I didn't know what teaching in a foreign context would entail. And so there was all these things that I had to navigate and make sure that I succeed in my role as a teaching assistant. I succeed in my role as a student, and also I had this expectation of also, having to make sure that I fit in into the society and the community and make sure that I'm thriving. So all these emotions were going through my head, but I'm sure we'll get into it in some of these experiences later in the discussion, but yeah.
Oh, Salome, thank you so much. I can't imagine the tension that would build as you make that drive down from Columbus and start to approach Southeast Ohio. So thank you so much. Diane, I'd be interested in understanding the role of your office in receiving new international students as they come to Athens. So they arrive at Athens, they start to move through their program of study. How does your office engage with them?
So thank you, Chip. That's a great question. And I think I am happy to hear Salome talk about all of the feelings that students have, because I think that's one of the most important pieces for all of us to understand, is the excitement and stress that comes with it. And so our office does our best to try to support students as they start to navigate everything that comes with leaving your home and coming to the United States to study. And we start that through communicating with students prior to their arrival in the US. And we share information with them about housing options, about transportation options, about which airport to fly into, and the fact that the airport is an hour and a half away from the actual campus. We try to share a little bit with them about what things are available on campus, how to get connected with people. This year with the pandemic, we had to do orientation virtually. And so we added something that we're actually going to keep, and that is virtual sessions ahead of time while students are still at home, so that we can allow them an opportunity to ask questions. And it's run by our peer advising team. So it's run by students. And so students can actually ask each other questions, which was really helpful. And we hope it will continue to be helpful going forward. Then once students actually arrive, we have someone at the airport for a few days, about 4 days before orientation begins. And that is prior to when school starts, to welcome them and make sure that they get to Athens. And then we provide an orientation. The orientation is all kinds of things that students need to know, information about health insurance and information about how to be successful in the classroom, but it also is an opportunity for them to try to connect with other students that are arriving. And we have social events. Again, the pandemic has stopped that, but we're excited to start again in person. And then once they're here and get started on their program, it really depends on the student and what they need. So we may provide answers to immigration questions. We may provide support for them to bring their spouse or children to the United States if they're not here in the beginning. We support them if they're going to travel. So there are immigration rules for international students when they want to travel outside of the country and come back. We do actually do monitoring of enrollment, which is a requirement of the government. And so that is something that we do, and we make sure that our students are enrolled full time. We help students find resources on campus. Like our goal in ISFS is to make sure that we are providing that kind of door or window to the rest of the university. So if a student comes to our office and asks a question, we don't just send them to another office to find out if that office can help them. We try to make sure that office can help them before making that connection for them. We do support students who are struggling, whether it's just listening and trying to help them think about what are my next steps and how can I get support, or reaching out to the offices to get support for them. And then we also provide support for students who want to have extra training opportunities, which are through programs called curricular practical training or optional practical training. And those are opportunities for students to take part in training outside of the university. So those are just a few of the things that we do, but we try our best to support our students because we recognize that their support system is very far away and often maybe in a completely different time zone. And so getting a connection with someone when you really need it during the day may not be easy for our students.
Thanks, Diane. You know, as I thought about students arriving, can you give us an idea of how much experience have our international students had with the US or with Ohio prior to coming to the university? So are they mostly aware of what they're coming into, or are they mostly unaware?
So that's a really good question, Chip. And I can tell you that it depends on the student. So a lot of our students at Ohio University are international students, are graduate students, and some may have had experiences prior to coming to Ohio University in the United States. However, there are a lot of students that have never been here before. And I have an interesting story, or it's fun for me. When I first started working in the international area at the university, one of the very first days, a student had arrived at the Yamada International House, which is the building that houses the Center for International Studies and Global Affairs at the university. And I was talking to them, just kind of trying to understand what was going on. And it dawned on me that that student had actually just arrived. And I said, "Do you mean you just actually arrived in the United States?" And the student said, "Yes." And he was so excited, and he started talking about his experience at the airport and how excited he was to be here. And so, you know, it was that at that point that I realized, wow, like not only do our students, you know, have the capacity and almost the bravery to leave their home and leave everything that they know and come here to study, but they are really focused on their goals. He was already able to talk about, this is why I'm here and this is what I want to do. And so I think to answer your question, it depends on the student, but there are plenty of students that have never been to the US before. And so it's really our job to try to help them to understand what is here and what's available for them.
Thanks so much. So Jerry, I've been on this campus a long time. I know you've had several years of experience working with international students on this campus. I'm really interested to know what you've learned about international students and how they arrive, how they settle into the university and in Athens, Ohio.
That's a great question, Chip. I've learned many things over the years, and I think one thing that I've learned and that frames my view on the conversation we're having today is the students who are coming from abroad are coming to the most highly individualistic society culture in the world. And so when you look at somebody like Salome, when she talked about driving down from Athens, if you look at a ranking on a scale of 100 for highly individualistic countries, the United States ranks 91. They score 91. A country like Kenya scores 25. A country like Korea scores 18. A country like Ghana is 15. And so what that tells you is those students are coming from cultures and societies that are highly group oriented, where they have an inbuilt support network, but they're coming to a culture where self-reliance and independence is highly valued, where you're expected to look after yourself and your immediate family too. But as a student, you look after yourself. So what does that mean? The values underlying this perspective in the United States is we value directness, assertiveness in the communication. We value informality more than formality. We're allowed to self-promote ourselves. We could toot our own horn, show off, and we can question authority as well as respect authority. And what that does is, by coming into this new culture, what Salome had referred to before, it can create this visceral discomfort in a student. You understand things are different here, but not until you experience it do you really start feeling it. And that plays out in different ways that we see communication in the classroom as well. For example, in the United States, classrooms tend, not all, but many of them tend to be student-centered, where the responsibility is on the student to work in group work, discussions. You can disagree in the classroom. You could possibly disagree with the teacher. Of course, you want to be polite, and you'll have to learn how to do that. But you're also expected to be spontaneous in your feedback and your questions and answers with the students. One of the students who came from Ghana, named Edward Benya, told me a story where when he first entered in the class, he would patiently wait with his arm raised to answer the questions, but all the other students would be just shouting out the questions. There was this give and take going on. And by the time the class ended, poor Edward was sitting there with his hand up, but everybody had left the classroom because the class was over. And not until he talked to his professor did he understand how he needed to change his behavior in order to participate in class. And teachers are also expecting students to go ahead and initiate conversation. But if you come from another culture, they're always expecting the teacher to do that. So you see, with all these differences, you could see this, again, this discomfort on the part of the students in the beginning, something that Salome referred to. But for me, then, that's where the dialogue starts, where both faculty, staff, and students need to enter in this bi-directional dialogue, so they're learning from each other, so then they can gain a really valuable learning experience for everybody while their students are in the United States.
Thanks, Jerry. So I'm going to go back to Salome, and Salome, I would say I'm from this region, and so it's really difficult for me to think about what it would be like to come from some other place in the world and plop yourself into Athens, Ohio. And you shared some of that anxiety and tension building from driving into from Columbus. But so give us an idea, of the arc of your story here, and how has your experience unfolded as you've gone through your studies?
Yeah, thank you so much. And just I've been really nodding to what Diane and Jerry have been talking about, because they really touch a lot on some of the experiences that I've had. So when I think about my experience here, I would categorize it into 3 categories. So first, there's the experience I've had within the campus community. And within this campus community, I'm going to talk about, my experience in the classroom, and then moving around, the vicinity and the, what constitutes the Ohio University campus. So for example, in the classroom, there's all this, the different hidden, I want to call it the hidden curriculum that I had to understand as an, as an international student. Just like Jerry was talking about, there's the expectation that, you have to be able to jump into conversations and go for office hours and do all these other things. I didn't know what office hours were. I didn't know how to, navigate some of all those other things that I was expected to do, because I think it was an expectation that I should know them. But as an international student who had come from a different educational system, those are things that I was trying to learn on the ground and going through my education. And so what I would say is that within the campus community, there's been a lot of support when you go to the international students and faculty services. When you talk to your professors, I've been able to collaborate with my professors and other students on different projects. And so over time, I have been able to experience a good sense of community within the campus community. The next category I would categorize my experience is my experience with fellow international students. And so with fellow international students, I feel like that's where I have found a buffer and a great social support network, because for me, it's easier for me to share my challenges and struggles with another international students, because I expect that they can relate to this experience, and especially the continuing international students or the current international students, they can share, resources that have worked for them, or they can be able to direct me to a service or an office that might help. So within the international student community, I've been able to find a lot of social support and friendship within that community. And we have the International Student Union, which is the umbrella organization that hosts a variety of international student organizations. So these international student organizations have been able to expose me, to different other, cultures, and I've met, different other international students through their events. And so the ISU also acts as a really good support system for international students. But now when I go to the community outside of Athens, of the community outside of Ohio University, now that's where I have had a little bit of a struggle, connecting with the community outside of campus, because as an international student, I've personally, faced discrimination based on my skin color and country of origin. I have experienced various microaggressions, and I've felt alienated and isolated in this community that I have been living in for 5 years. And it's just been really hard to connect with the local community members, have conversations and discussions. So it's been really hard to navigate and experience that sense of belonging with the outside community. And as I talk about, the struggles, I should also acknowledge that there are different other, associations and organizations within the community that have been welcoming to me as an international student, and they've helped me try to connect with some local community members. For example, we have houses of worship, like churches, and I've been able to make some connections within those institutions. And also just other community organizations like Passion Works, which tries to invite international students to their events and tries to make them feel like they are a valued part of this community that I've been living in. So that's, in short, that's what my experience has been in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would be really curious to know, did you hold expectations prior to coming here, specifically about the community connections? Did you have any expectations on how easy or hard it would be? I mean, it sounds as though it has been tough. Your experience has been hard with that connection to the living community around Athens. So did you hold expectations on how that would go prior to arriving?
Yeah, I mean, I had, prior to coming, I had this, picture in my mind that I would have these really meaningful connections. I would be able to share my experience with the community members. I even carried, small souvenirs that I would be able to exchange, cultural artifacts that I would be able to exchange with the community. So I had this idea of, creating friendships and relationships with, different community members and just being integrated into the community. And I want to say that these expectations have not been met because, again, like I explained, there has been a little bit of a struggle in the sense that it's hard to connect with the community. And there could be different reasons to that because even when it comes to language is very cultural. And so you find that there could be some, like even in a conversation with community members, they could be alluding to different cultural things that I'm not aware of. And so I still feel left out of the conversation. Again, even like with the language barrier, it's hard for, some international students to communicate with the local community members. So there has been a little bit of a struggle and a barrier in the way I relate with the local community members.
Just want to say that if you do pass me in the hall as we get back to normal and on campus, and you have any of those souvenirs handy, I'd be happy. I'd be happy to take one of those. So I want to go to Diane, and given the information that Salome provided about her experience and what Jerry has talked about, I'd really like to hear what you think are Ohio's strengths, and then follow up with what are Ohio's weaknesses in supporting the international students.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that's a very tough question, so I'll do my very best. So we have strengths at the university, and I want to say that it's interesting, for me to say what I'm going to say, considering what Jerry was talking about with the individual versus the collective societies. So there are a lot of individuals at the university that are supportive of international students, whether it's a faculty member or a staff member or someone who has had a similar study abroad experience, and maybe it's easy for them to connect. So I think generally there are lots of places where a student may encounter someone that will be willing and able to support them in what they need. And we recently did a survey of international students to try to understand a little bit more about the culture at the university. And lots of students made comments about how they really enjoyed the faculty that they worked with, and that the faculty members were very supportive, and that their students talked about how they met other students when they worked for dining services or culinary or transportation and parking services. So there are lots of experiences, again, that happen individually where students feel very supportive. I think in addition, the organizations that Salome mentioned, which are International Student Union and all of the organizations that are under their umbrella, including the Indian Students Association, the Iranian Student Society, the African Student Union, the Nepalese Student Union. There are many different organizations that support students, and I know from all the learning that has happened for me over the last few years that these organizations are actually connecting with students before they get here, because maybe someone has a friend here and they can find that connection. I think what we need to do, at least on that side, is to make sure we're providing a more easy connection for all students. So I think that some of the weaknesses that we have, and I think we're working on them. So one of the weaknesses I think we have is making sure that students are able to connect with domestic students, making sure that students feel like they are welcomed. Probably isn't the right word, but trying to understand how students know they're part of the community that Salome was talking about. Like, how do you recognize that you're part of the community? And I think we need to understand that from students so that we can help to build that. You know, if you understand where the missing pieces are, you can help to build a bridge between people, whether it's students in the Athens community, students, international and domestic students, or even international students from different places. So I think that we can do a better job listening and learning from the students about what they need and making sure that we work together to try to build those things. And we do that in ISFS, and I know that OPI does that and many other programs as well. I think one of the other pieces that's hard is there is a lack of cultural understanding at the university, and that students are subject to racism and microaggressions, and Salome mentioned that, but it's in the classroom and it's outside of the classroom. And so I think that we're making strides. Like, we have an expectation in the new BRICS program that students do have an intercultural 2 hours of an intercultural experience, whether it's a class or something else that would fulfill that requirement. But I think generally the university needs to work together to make sure that we are learning how to be culturally competent, learning how to be understanding of the fact that not everybody is the same, and that's okay. And how can we work together to really open up that dialogue and listen to each other? I think the final thing that is a weakness that has been alluded to multiple times is just this lack of connection between students and the communities and the multiple communities that they encounter. And I think that's a tough piece as well, when one of the things that I think Jerry and Salome and I have talked about that we recognize is that the world has changed quite a bit, right, over the last like 20, 30 years. And one of the things is, in order for us to know how to build these connections or to know how to make those opportunities available, we need to understand the capacity of our community. Like, if you think about what happened, and you may not know, but during the pandemic, students were stuck in a really untenable position financially. The community of Athens really stepped up. I mean, we have many individual donors, we had many organizations donating money to support them. So we know that people will be there. But understanding the capacity of people, do people have time and capacity to welcome a student for Thanksgiving dinner, or to come over and go for a walk together? Do they have time and capacity to be able to be a mentor for a student, or to introduce them to someone else who might be able to help them along in their career? So I think in order to do these things that we know we need, we actually need to understand like the capacity that we have as a university, that our students have, and that our community has. And then we also need to listen to our students to understand really what helps them to know that they are part of our community, and what kinds of things we need to add to build upon that.
Thank you. So Jerry, I know you've worked with a lot of the international students. I know you've had an opportunity to see different ways in which the community has been engaged. And so I would be really interested to hear from your experience, what do you think works in that community connection?
Well, thanks, Chip. What I think works is when you can really step outside your normal behavior. And I'll use the International Student Task Force as an example. And Diane had just mentioned it prior to this, where starting last March, I was invited to a group called the International Student Task Force, ISTF. And I didn't know what it was at first. And so I was invited to the meeting on Zoom. Actually, it was the first time. And I saw some familiar faces, but I saw other faces that I had not seen before too. And it was the purpose of the task force was to really share the plight of the students, again, that Diane had talked about during a COVID situation, food insecurity, economic insecurity, and how we could reach out and help. Now, one thing, even though we are an individualistic culture, like Diane said, Americans do reach out. But what is, I think, different about it is the students initiated the task force. And so the students, and they were coming from collectivist cultures, and I don't want to stereotype anybody with this. I'm speaking in generalities, but the students initiated it. And I think in many of their cultures, at least when I've lived in collectivist cultures, when I would go there, people reached out to me automatically because of that group orientation. They would include me, and I learned a lot from that. But in America, people might not reach out to you unless you ask for it. But once you ask for it, they're very willing to reach out. And that's what I thought happened with the task force. The students reached out, they were saying, we have this need, and then I saw our community step up. And so what I feel a key to what really works is you step outside your comfort zone. And in this case, the task force, I think, did that. And we saw very good results. And also during that task force, we were able to, the Americans in the community were able to understand the students' perspective and how they were feeling. In fact, many times our meetings, we would take care of the business of dealing with the food insecurity, donations, trying to raise money, but then with the simple question of how are you feeling, that led to us being really an emotional support network for each other. And I know I learned a lot from the students, and I think the students learned a lot from the Americans that were in the crowd. So that's what I think really works, when you're able to step outside the comfort zone to make that connection. And this community is willing to do that, I know. We need to organize it, I think, better. What I've seen haven't worked for students, I think, is when, and Salome referred to this, that it's very necessary to have this international support network of your other students who come from your country or another country, because again, they share this common experience of being in another culture, in America here. So they could see things we can't see because they're looking at things with fresh eyes. And I think there's a little danger, though, if we don't reach out as a community to ask these students what we need and they only rely on themselves for support. Then that, to me, is when I've seen things don't work. The students maybe got inaccurate information, they had incomplete information, and I've seen them get involved in things that they could have avoided or they probably shouldn't have. So I really think that creating that cultural friend with that host national, in this case the Americans, is a real key to all this. And I think that task force was a perfect example, and a big shout out to the international students who are too numerous to mention here for organizing it, and also for ISFS, for Diane as well.
Thanks. So what I've learned through a part of our discussion today is that the students themselves, recognize the need to provide, to support each other. And that is good to learn. Salome, I would really like to hear what has been your best experience then with the community. Have you had a good, positive experience to take away from your time here in Athens?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Chip. And just, I think both Diane and Jerry have mentioned a little bit of that. I think what has been really one of the strengths is for me, the individuals, for example, faculty, individual community members who are willing to listen to the concerns of international students and direct you to, like the relevant resources, or even be part of like that resource or the help that international students need. So I have had like those positive experiences with, individual faculty members, my fellow students, and even, like reaching out to different departments on campus. Another thing that has really been helpful for me with, like connecting with the community is the International Week. I think the I Week that we just had I think it was last week. So during that week, I think that's when I, as an international student, have really felt seen on campus, because we usually have the flags displayed on College Green. We have the International Street Fair. And during that street fair, like different organizations can display what they want, and then community members can come and participate in the different displays. If they want to buy maybe something from the organization, or just hear about, like what that organization is about, then they are welcome to do so. So during that street fair, the International Street Fair, that's the time when I've been able to really, really connect with the local community and just feel really seen as an international student. In addition to that, I also had a really positive experience as an instructor when I was teaching Swahili. in the linguistics program. So in the summer, we used to have a Swahili summer program where we would teach Swahili to local high school students. And so we would go around different local high schools, recruiting students to participate in our program. And that was such an interesting time for me because we were able to connect with, like high school students, their parents, and travel across, like the different counties surrounding Athens, just talking about, Swahili, which is my first language, and talking about my culture and sharing it with other people in the community. And during that program, we would also take students, the students who participated, to Columbus for them to interact with the Somali community in Columbus and other Kenyans in Columbus so that they can practice the Swahili that they had learned. And it was just such a rewarding experience for me to see that, I'm helping the students that I'm teaching connect with a community that I can relate to. And in doing so, I'm also connecting with these students and connecting with their parents and everybody else that they would bring, because they were allowed to bring people to the program. So everybody they would invite into the program, like their parents, their siblings. It was just a really good way for me to connect with them. So those are some of the positive experiences that I've had with connecting with the community.
That's fantastic. So I'm sitting here and thinking about, and I'll probably come to each of you on this, but I'm thinking about as somebody listening and learning today and not having had significant experience with our international students, and Diane, I'll come to you first. So what do you feel are like priorities behind helping students or engaging students? Like where would be a good place to start with something like that?
So Chip, do you mean like generally as a person? Like how did I start where I'm? Go ahead.
Yes, I would say generally as a person, as somebody like me or other community members, what I'm hearing is a difficult ability to really connect with the community. And I would be interested to know, you've had a lot of experience from the university side, but how can community members come in and be supportive of the international students?
So that's a really good question. I can tell you, just because I did have my experiences through the university, that I started by being open. So when I started working with international students, like I really didn't know much, and I wasn't going to pretend that I knew a lot. And so you really need to have a curiosity and a willingness to understand. You also need to not be afraid to make a mistake and, to be honest about it, like being open with students and talking with them and understanding where they're coming from, takes a little bit of patience with yourself, because you're not going to understand everything and you're not going to necessarily do things right if there is a right way to do things, because you're building a relationship with someone. So I think those are good places to start. And then beyond that, if you want to get involved with international students, you can reach out to the International Student Union organization to see if there are ways to get involved. I can tell you of a small experience that we had. So every year for International Street Fair, we put the international flags up on the green. And I think everyone gets excited about it. And we actually had a community member and her son come to help us without knowing that they were coming. And she just came and said, "We really want to help. We love doing this. Can we be here?" And of course, we're happy to have help. And she and her son had an absolute blast. And it was great for all of us because we all got to hang out and talk to each other. So sometimes just taking that first step, like coming to the International Street Fair or coming to an event and just kind of stepping, as Jerry said multiple times, like outside of your comfort zone, if it's uncomfortable. And I can tell you, I'm not a person who gets excited about going out into big groups. And so when we do these big events, I have to get prepped for it. I have to be ready to hang out with a lot of people. And I don't think I'm the only person that feels that way. And so it's okay to kind of push yourself a little bit and to go and just learn and be open to what you can and be willing to share. I think students want to hear as much from us as community members as we want to hear from them. So I think it's important to be able to initiate or take part in, if it's already initiated, in that give and take and that understanding of each other.
Yeah, I think that's really good to hear, and encouraging people to just make this step. And it's okay if you get something a little bit wrong, but through respect and communication, I think we can work through those things. Jerry, I would be really interested to hear what you might think about that. How do people step up with little experience and engage and support our international students?
Sure, Chip. Before I answer that, I'll make one comment about, being afraid of making mistakes. I was lucky. I was with the Peace Corps, Fulbright, all these things. So I've had I student taught abroad before it was popular in Brazil and lived with a Brazilian family. And the thing that I learned from all these experiences, if you make an effort and to learn about somebody else's culture like that, they forgive any mistake you do, almost any mistake. So don't let that hold you back. That's one thing. And to go back now to the question too, I was thinking just about some of the programming that we also offer in OPI. We have something that was really targeted for students, but now listening to everybody today, I'm thinking we need to involve the community as well. We have something called the ICUC. It's called the Intercultural Understanding Certificate. It's a social certificate. And in this certificate, we have a global conversation partner program. We have an international conversation hour. And we never thought, and this is our fault, to actually advertise it to the community so much. And that's probably something we could do. We are always targeting it for mostly undergraduate students in the classroom. I realize we need to broaden that. And in that, we also ask students to participate in ISU events, Multicultural Center, the Women's Center, the LGBTQ Center. And the ICUC was purposely designed with that acronym, meaning IC and UC. We all see together. And through that, we're trying to build this sense of community. But listening to Salome today, to Diane, Chip, your questions too, I realize we need to expand that program too as one step. I think there's another step, and this goes back to the task force. I give credit to the task force, is to create, maybe recreate, bring back something we used to call the Athens Friends of International Students. Maybe we create a 2.0, where in the past with that organization, we matched up students and community members, and they were considered a host family, but that didn't mean the student was living with them necessarily, but the students and families would get together for social occasions. The students themselves could ask the community members questions about the Athens community. They could go to the movies together, go uptown for some coffee, maybe make a trip to Columbus, go to the farmer's market. And there was one great example of somebody stepping outside their comfort zone in a way, and that was Judy McGinn. And I've mentioned Judy McGinn in another talk during International Week, but she just went to the international office one day and said, I would like to have an international student from Ghana. And they matched her up with an international student, Edward Benya. They matched Judy up with Edward's wife, Pat, who was really confined to her apartment. She had a child, and if the child was sick, she really didn't know where to go to for help because Edward was busy working on campus. He was driving the Bobcat shuttle. He was washing cars in the garage. He was still going to classes. He was studying and doing his homework, and he was trying to take care of his family. But Judy McGinn, she was another former Peace Corps volunteer from the Philippines. She reached out and they connected with Pat, and they had really a true cross-cultural exchange where Judy not only taught Pat about America, but Pat taught Judy about Ghana. And it reached to such a degree that they named their second child, who was a boy, Jude, in honor of Judy McGinn. That to me was the gold standard of community engagement.
That's fantastic. So I'd like to move to another sort of topic area. I know the pandemic has changed my way of work significantly over the past year. And so Salome, I am really interested on how the coronavirus has impacted your stay here in Athens. And now hopefully we'll be getting out of that, going through the summer and into next fall, but I'm sure it's had some impact. So can you fill us in on what you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really relevant and interesting question, Chip, and thank you for asking that. So with the pandemic happening, I just remember in March when, universities announced, we are not coming back from spring break. And a lot of the domestic students started packing up and going home. For international students, it wasn't, we just couldn't pack up and leave to go home, because even planning to go home, you have to put a lot of planning in, the process, that a lot of financial implications that come with traveling, because for me, a ticket to Kenya is, $1,500. That is not something that I can just, immediately, scoop up and decide to travel home. But even during that time, there were a lot of travel restrictions. So a lot of international students could not be able to just travel back home. So everybody was isolated, but I feel like for me as an international student, I was more isolated because I didn't know what was happening back home. I didn't know, how I was going to, when the pandemic would end so that I can be able to go and see my family. And so a lot of international students really were hit hard by, the pandemic, because it just intensified the anxiety and, depression that was happening at that point. But even during that time, Jerry talked about the International Student Task Force. I think it was a really good opportunity for international students to just support each other and understand, this is what is happening. How can we, how can we advocate for ourselves and be able to help fellow international students meet their needs? And we are really grateful for the people who put it together and for all the donors who donated towards that fund, because it ended up being such a good resource for international students. We also saw a lot of support from different departments. Personally, from my department, the Department of Higher Education and Student Affairs, our faculty were very responsive in just reaching out, through emails, holding regular town hall meetings to check in and ask, how are you doing? And even for international students, when there was an immigration rule that was a policy that was passed concerning, enrollment, classroom enrollment, and saying that you shouldn't be enrolled in online classes, the International Student Office and also our individual departments were very responsive in reaching out and asking, how can we support you? So that support that we received was really, really important in just helping us try to navigate those hard times. But again, it was just a very trying time for international students.
Thanks. It has been a trying time, I'm sure. And I know that it's both made my work difficult, and I've learned a lot from it, as I'm sure we all have. So Diane, I would really be interested in to understand the impact that the pandemic has had on your office and what you're doing to mitigate those.
So thank you. That's an excellent question. And, I will just support Salome and her comments about how tough this has been on international students. So not only were they starting out in a place where the immigration regulations had been more confusing, there had been, over the last 3 years before the pandemic began, there was a lot of changes to immigration and discussions about changes that added stress. And then as soon as the pandemic hit, students lost on-campus jobs, they lost internships, they couldn't necessarily connect with their family easily, they couldn't get home, families were impacted, and when you're coming from a culture where your family is so important and supporting each other is so important. Not being able to be there for your family had to have added an extra layer as well. For our office, we definitely went to working at home, and I still work at home. However, we did leave our office open 2 days a week because international students and scholars, which we support also, actually still need to have access to paper documents. They need ink signatures on things. And the USCIS, which is the United States Customs and Immigration Service, will be sending OPT work authorization cards to students, and they come to our office, and students need those if they're trying to get a job. So one of the things that we did was we tried to make sure that we were still there for students. We created virtual advising sessions so that students could still meet with us and do just that by walk-in. But our walk-in actually happens on Zoom. It doesn't happen in the office anymore. And we started during the beginning of the pandemic, and during the summer, we did some virtual sessions where we met with students just to listen. And a lot of times we ended up talking about like what it looked like outside, or did you take a walk or not, or what kinds of games would you be playing if you're with your friends? So it was more just a connection point for all of us to be able to support each other. And at the same time, behind the scenes, we were working with the university and thankfully eventually with the International Student Task Force to advocate for students. And we were able to move a lot of things forward as a collective group. So we've learned a lot through this pandemic, not only about different ways to connect with students, but the fact that we really need as a community to be able to work together and to not be afraid to reach out to each other and not be afraid to try to build connections and say, I need help, and how can we work together to make things happen. So I think that's been a really nice thing that we've taken away from this pandemic. But it's still tough. We still want to make sure that we are supporting students and make sure that we're able to support ourselves as well. I think that's one of the things, like you mentioned, Chip, in the beginning, talking about how it's impacted you. In order for us to continue to support students, we have to support each other and support ourselves so that we can actually be there and do a good job.
So you mentioned something there that I'm not sure what it was. OPT, optional practical training. Somebody's feeding me and letting me know. Can you explain that to me?
I sure can. So international students that come in on what's called an F1 visa. So most of our students at Ohio University are on F1 visas. We do have students on another visa type called J1, but we'll stick with the F1s. So it is a benefit that comes with the F1 visa, and it's the option to do practical training in your academic area. And optional practical training typically takes place when you graduate. So it's typically a post-graduation experience. So let's say, I am studying linguistics and I want to go and work for Jerry Kurzik in the OP program. And so if I have OPT, that means that as a student, I can work off campus. So that's one piece that is kind of a prior to piece that you should understand as well. International students on F1 visas are not allowed to work off campus. They can work on campus, but they cannot work off campus without authorization, which means someone within the regulations, whether it's someone in my office or the customs office in the US government, has to give them permission to work. And so OPT is one of those permissions to work off campus in another role. So that could be anywhere. And so we have students that are Ohio University students that are working in other states doing their optional practical training. So I hope that helps.
Oh, it does. It does. And you made I think a very good point there. The inability for international students to work off campus, that as a result of the pandemic and when Ohio University had to close down, it was an immediate impact, right? Because no job, there was no job.
And Chip, you bring up a really good point that, I tried to, the best way I can describe the way that I felt students were impacted after the pandemic began, and really once the university made the decision to keep all of us safe by shutting down, our students were put in what I would call like a wall of rock. So you hear people talk about this rock and hard place. That's not what students were going through. They didn't have an option. So they couldn't work. And many students who would have gone home couldn't get out of the country. Many students who would work off campus at an internship using work authorization, they couldn't go because the internships were ended because the pandemic was shutting down state after state after state. And at the same time, they still had bills to pay. They still had to pay the rent. They still had to make sure that utilities were covered. They still had to find food. And this is where that value of community, the International Student Task Force, and the community members, whether it was university or Athens community members, that they were able to gather and that they were able to encourage, really made a difference for students during this time, because our students did not have an option.
Yeah. Jerry, I would be really interested to hear how you've worked with your students and what your observations of your students have been and what you've seen during this past year.
Sure.
Life.
I think the number one observation for me was students really value in-person classes. There is a place for virtual learning for sure. And there are some things that we're going to take away and make changes in our program, but often they would say, are we going in person next semester? Are we going to have classes in person next semester? There was no replacing that interpersonal contact you had in the classroom. And that's what I was curious to see how the students would respond. Now, because we're forced to be virtual, there were some adjustments that we made. We put all our classes at a time that would be convenient, like usually in the morning, so that if they were overseas taking their OP class too, it wasn't so late in the evening. So typically the sweet spot for our classes was between 8 a.m. and 11:30 or so, because sometimes we were dealing with 12-hour time differences. So that's one adjustment we made with our class schedule. We have an advisor, I'd almost say a cultural advisor within our program. We also kept that on because Salome had mentioned before, students aren't used to office hours. That concept is it's unusual. And so we make sure that our students who are studying English for academic purposes go to office hours so that they get used to what that concept is all about. But we were doing it online, but we were still doing that, having our advisor and meeting all the new students so that there was that contact just to check in with them to see how they were doing. We kept our conversation hour also. It went virtual, but we kept that as well too. And I think that what I've learned also in listening to Diane talking about the optional practical training, the need for our students to be able to work. And I think you look at other countries such as Canada, who I think have a much more welcoming environment and a different approach to working for their international students. I think the United States should start looking at other ways we can adjust the optional practical training and support it. And I would advocate for people in the audience to stay abreast of the political events in the country too, and advocate for making it more welcoming for international students and more welcoming for trying to work in the United States too. And we understand they're still students, but we also understand that university budgets aren't what they used to be too. And so providing TA ships, GA ships too, it's helpful for students to have other sources of economic opportunities as well. So those are things that, I feel, and I've appreciated listening to Salome, Diane too, getting their perspectives on this. And if there's anything about COVID, and the task force was one example, I think being virtual, this was one of the good things that brought us together, and I met people that I wouldn't have met ordinarily because I would have been so busy doing other things, and I was able to expand my network right here in Athens. And so I'm appreciative of that.
Excellent. I think just that idea of using this time to expand your networks is a really good point. It is a good time to do that because people have been so communicative over different platforms. We're going to sort of begin to wrap up today's discussion, and I'd like to go back to Diane. And can you just give us a final thought, a reiteration of what you feel is most important, or a new thought, but just kind of let us walk away with what you feel is important in this effort.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks. So one thing I want to make very clear, and I know that a lot of people, when they attend these events, they want something to walk away with. And so for me, I want to make sure that everybody understands that the pandemic is still happening, and I know it feels different. But what I mean by that, and why I bring it up, is that international students are still going to have some challenges this summer. So we're going to go back to the same thing where the university may not be fully operational. And so the jobs that might be available on campus may not be there. Internships that students may go to make money for the summer that they would use to sustain their rent and things like that may not be available as well. So there are opportunities for people who have the ability and willingness to donate to support international students. And there are 2 international funds that support students. One is the International Student Emergency Relief Fund. The other one is the Joanne B. Stedman International Student Grant Fund. And so those are opportunities, again, if people have the ability and the willingness, they can do that. The other thing to keep in mind is that as we move to spring and summer, there are going to be needs at our food pantry, and that's there is a food pantry on campus, and you can learn more about that by going to their website, and it's called The Cat's Cupboard. And in addition, there are other food banks that support students and community organizations, whether it's a church, as Salome had mentioned previously, or other just local food banks. And so if you have, again, the ability and the willingness, you can always donate there because you never know who might need it. The other thing to keep in mind is that don't ever, and I think we've talked about this more than once, don't ever be afraid to reach out. And you can reach out to the International Student Union or International Student Faculty Services or to the OP program if there is an excitement that maybe you have about trying to reach out to a student or to learn more about international students. And don't ever be afraid to try, because you might just open your mind and open your heart more than you already have. And it's always nice to have that extra, openness, because it also can fill you up as well. I think that's one of the things that we all have learned through this pandemic. We can't be together, and so we try to make connections virtually. And so sometimes having a new connection with maybe a new friend, whether it's an international student or giving an international student an opportunity to have a friendship with you, fills you up in ways that maybe you weren't expecting. And that's always nice, especially when we can't be together in person.
Thank you. Jerry, any final thoughts and takeaways you'd like to provide?
Oh yeah, thank you, Chip. Just to follow up on what Diane said about the Emergency Relief Fund and the Stedman Fund too. I want to remind everybody that April 21st is Ohio Giving Day, and that could be an opportune time if you're so inclined to contribute at that time, because the economic insecurity for our students is still there, and as well as donate, as Diane said, to the Bobcat Depot. And one thing that people should realize too is the Bobcat food pantry. The food pantry, Cat's Cupboard. Is that food is not only for international students, but it's for all Ohio students. And on our task force, we have a little shout out to Kara Davis, who was who works there, volunteers there, and she joined our task force, and it is for everybody. And she reminds us of that as well. And what I would like to see continue, even though in the summer, even though we'll still be virtual, that we continue our task force to not only advocate for continuing needs, but also to provide that emotional support and invite anyone who's interested to join that group as well. And I think you'll learn a lot. I learned a great deal from it. And I'm somebody who's lived overseas quite a bit, but I learned from that group every time we met. So thank you very much for allowing me to participate today.
Thank you, Jerry. Salome, I just want to say that your courage to travel across the world to get an education to me is amazing and inspiring. All of our international students, the effort they go through to get their education is inspiring, and we should all take something from that. But I'm interested in hearing from you on what you would like to provide as final thoughts and takeaways for us.
Yeah, so just this whole panel, I think, has been very informative. And so just, having more sessions like this where, we can discuss, like what are some of the challenges that international students are facing, because first, understanding the need is one of the steps that we need so that we can be able to understand how to support. And so I think having more sessions of this is really, really important in like taking that step to continue supporting international students and making them feel included as part of the community. But one of the just final takeaways that I can say is that international students, we crave, like that connection. We crave to experience that sense of belonging. And like Diane and Jerry had mentioned, many international students usually seek post-study employment in their country, using, like programs or the training or the CPT. And so engaging them in the community and helping them feel like they are part of the community is one way of helping them gain that are necessary for them to be able to thrive in the work environments that they're going to be in after finishing their studies. So let's continue to, like support international students. Let's continue to welcome them and make them feel included and feeling like they are an important part of this community. And thank you so much for having me on this panel.
Thank you. So in closing, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today and sharing their time and their experiences and their knowledge about and around this topic. I want to thank for everybody that joined us live today. Thank you for your time and spending it with us today. I'd like to remind you that there is an evaluation placed in the chat. We encourage you, we would love for you to take a few moments to complete the evaluation, give us some feedback on your experience with our discussion. I want to remind you that all of the Patton College Munch and Learn panel discussions will be available on the Patton College YouTube channel. And with that, I would encourage you to have your friends go and watch it. And I want to thank everybody and have a great day.